He shouldn't have said it. Everyone in the mess hall knew it the moment the young seal opened his mouth, joking loudly about the ancient vet eating alone in the corner. But no one expected the old man to lift his head, or for 11 simple words to stop an entire room of warriors in absolute silence. What he said next would change the way every seal in that base looked at him forever. If stories like this remind you that real heroism isn't always loud or young, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves powerful military stories, and subscribe to Endless Stories so you never miss another tale that stays with you long after it ends. The noon rush had just started in the Coronado mess hall, the kind of restless military lunch hour where steel trays clattered, conversations overlapped, and men fresh from training laughed louder than they meant to. The air smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner, and protein-heavy meals meant to fuel bodies pushed to the limit. At the far corner, away from the noise and bravado, an old man sat alone at a small metal table. His posture was calm, almost deliberate, as if solitude had long ago become his natural environment. His field jacket, faded from years of sun, sand, and stories, rested over the back of his chair. His hands, lined and steady, moved slowly as he ate, showing a quiet dignity that didn't need an audience. Most didn't notice him. Those who did assumed he was a retired mechanic or perhaps a former quartermaster visiting the base. No patches, no visible rank, no reason, at least to the untrained eye, to believe he had ever carried anything heavier than a toolkit. But a few older SEALs recognized the way he scanned the room without moving his head, how he positioned himself with his back to the wall, how his senses stayed awake even when his eyes lowered to his plate. They didn't approach him, not out of disrespect, but because some men wore a silence so deep that interrupting it felt wrong. At a nearby table sat a group of fresh SEALs, newly badged and still carrying the raw, nervous energy of men trying too hard to belong. Among them was Kyle Mercer, a muscular, sharp-tongued operator barely 24, and proud in a way only someone who hadn't yet been humbled could be. He noticed the old man after his buddies did, and when he caught a glimpse of the jacket, plain, worn, stripped of insignia, he smirked. "Hey, check this out," Kyle said loudly enough for the tables around him to hear. "Looks like someone's grandpa wandered in from the retirement home." A few SEALs shifted uncomfortably. One nudged him. "Cut it, Mercer. Leave him alone." But Kyle wasn't done. Ego rarely knows when it has crossed a line. "Nah, look at him. Bet the old guy forgot what rank he ever was." He cupped his hands around his mouth and raised his voice. "Hey, old-timer, what rank were you? Assistant coffee brewer?" A couple of immature laughs slipped out, just enough to encourage him, just enough to thicken the tension. The older operators had gone quiet now. Their eyes moved not to Kyle, but to the old man. The old veteran didn't react at first. He finished chewing, placed his fork down with slow precision, and took one breath. Steady, composed, intentional. Then he lifted his head, and every SEAL who knew how to read men felt something shift. Not anger, not embarrassment, something colder, something heavier, something earned. Kyle, expecting a timid reply or maybe a confused stare, leaned back with a cocky grin. But the old man didn't look confused. He looked at Kyle with eyes that had seen more battlefields than the young SEAL had birthdays. Eyes that carried deserts, jungles, mountains, and the ghosts that still walked them. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it was strong enough to cut straight through the noise of the mess hall. And in that moment, those who understood knew one thing with absolute certainty. Kyle Mercer had just picked the wrong man to joke with. The mess hall didn't fall silent all at once. It happened in waves. First, the tables closest to the old man quieted, their conversations fading as they watched him lift his head fully for the first time. Then the neighboring tables paused, sensing a shift in the air without yet knowing why. Soon even the far end of the hall, where recruits joked loudly over trays of food, felt the tension sliding in like an invisible tide. Kyle Mercer's grin flickered, just a small hesitation, but enough for his teammates to notice. He had expected amusement, annoyance, maybe even a bit of confusion from the harmless old retiree. But the man looking back at him wasn't confused, and he wasn't amused. There was something about him, something unmistakable, that made even men who didn't know him instinctively sit straighter. The old veteran studied Kyle for a moment, not unkindly, but with the quiet intensity of someone who had assessed threats professionally for decades. His eyes were calm. Too calm. They were the eyes of a man who had already survived everything Kyle was still training to fear. Finally, the man wiped his mouth with a folded napkin, set it neatly beside his plate, and spoke. "You want to know my rank," he said, his voice even and steady. "Because you think rank tells you who a man is." Kyle blinked, thrown off by the unexpected poise. I mean, it was just a joke, old-timer." But the veteran continued as though Kyle hadn't spoken at all. "Rank is something the Navy gives you. Can be pinned on, stripped off, lost or traded. Doesn't mean much on its own." A few older SEALs exchanged glances. His voice, his tone, his cadence. There was familiarity in it, like hearing a song they hadn't listened to in years but still remembered by heart. Kyle forced a laugh. "So what, you never made it past E3? The veteran looked down for a brief second, as if weighing the value of truth against the danger of revealing too much. Then he lifted his gaze again, and this time the look in his eyes was different, soft, almost regretful. "Young man," he said quietly, "I stopped worrying about rank the day the men I served with stopped coming home." The mess hall went still. Someone at the far end of the room set their fork down too loudly, and the clatter echoed like a gunshot. Kyle's smirk vanished completely now, replaced not with fear but something far more vulnerable, confusion giving way to dawning awareness. The veteran went on, his voice gentle, almost reflective. "Rank doesn't follow you into a firefight. It doesn't shield you from shrapnel. It doesn't keep your hands warm when you're dragging a friend through mud and blood. And it sure doesn't matter when you're the last one standing." He paused, and for the first time, Kyle noticed something he hadn't before. The man's hands, steady and purposeful, scarred in ways no accident or workshop injury could explain. One of the older SEAL chiefs, Henderson, a man who rarely spoke unless necessary, stood up slowly, his tray forgotten. His voice carried across the room in a low whisper. "No way. That can't be him." Kyle turned. "What? Him who?" Henderson didn't answer Kyle. He was looking directly at the old man now, breath caught in his throat, eyes widening with recognition. "Sir, forgive me, but are you?" The veteran held Henderson's stare for a long, quiet moment. Then he nodded once. Just once. Henderson snapped to attention so fast his chair toppled behind him. The room erupted, not in noise, but in absolute stillness. Every SEAL in that cafeteria froze like someone had cut the power. Kyle stared around, bewildered, watching elite operators. Men who had served on deployments, lost friends, taken fire, stand at attention without being ordered. He looked back at the veteran, heart thudding, finally understanding he had made a mistake he could never take back. The old man's next words were soft, but they hit harder than anything Kyle Mercer had ever felt. "My rank wasn't printed on a uniform," he said. "It was carved into the men who trusted me with their lives." And with that, he returned to his meal, leaving a hall full of warriors unable to move, breathe, or look away. Kyle Mercer swallowed hard. The joke was over, and so was the illusion of who he thought that old man was. For a long moment after the veteran returned to eating, no one in the mess hall moved. The clatter of trays, the scraping of chairs, even the humming of the overhead lights seemed to fade beneath the weight of unspoken realization pressing over the room. Kyle Mercer felt his pulse hammering in his throat as he looked around, trying to understand what he had just triggered. He could see it in the faces of several senior operators. Shock, disbelief, something like reverence. And he suddenly knew this wasn't a misunderstanding or some exaggerated tale. Whatever the old man had been in his past, it was big enough that hardened SEALs were frozen in place waiting for confirmation that already hung between them. Chief Henderson was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, not with swagger or command but with a measured respect rarely seen outside ceremonies or funerals. Kyle had never seen Henderson stand like that for anyone except commanding officers or families of fallen teammates. Henderson cleared his throat and looked at the old man again as if afraid the moment might vanish if he blinked too long. "Sir, it really is you, isn't it?" he asked quietly. The veteran lifted his gaze just enough to meet Henderson's eyes. He didn't smile or gesture or make anything dramatic out of the moment. He simply nodded once, the same understated confirmation he'd given before. But the effect it had on the room was immediate. A wave of recognition rippled through several older SEALs. Men who had read reports, heard stories whispered in training halls, and studied missions that were officially listed as incomplete documentation. These were men who knew legends because their own careers had been shaped by the consequences of those legends. Kyle turned to his own teammates, hoping for some clue. "Who is he?" he whispered, but no one answered him. Some shook their heads, not in ignorance but because they could barely believe what they were seeing. Across the room, one SEAL leaned toward another and murmured, "I thought he was dead." Another replied, "Half his missions are still classified." Words like recon ghost, deep extraction, and the last man out drifted through the air, low and trembling. Kyle swallowed hard. None of it made sense. The man sitting alone didn't look dangerous. He didn't look like someone who had shaped entire operations. He looked like someone's gentle grandfather, the kind who fixed lawnmowers and watched local baseball games. But the men around Kyle, men he admired, men he wanted to become, were looking at the veteran the way rookies look at medals they haven't earned yet. Finally, Henderson turned to face Kyle. His expression caught somewhere between disappointment and pity. "Mercer," he said with a tight jaw. "You really had no idea who you were talking to?" Kyle opened his mouth but no words came out. Henderson didn't wait. "That man," he said, pointing but keeping his voice respectful, "is Commander Thomas Hale. He led operations your instructors can't even mention in training. Men lived because he refused to die. Missions succeeded because he stayed behind when others were evac'd. He didn't just wear the trident. He carried it for men who never made it home." Kyle felt his knees weaken. He looked back at the old man, Commander Hale, and saw him differently now. The scars on his knuckles weren't from tools. The stiff way he moved wasn't age alone. The silence he carried wasn't shyness. It was weight, the kind of weight a man never puts down. Kyle whispered, "But he's not wearing anything. No rank. No patches." Henderson nodded. "He doesn't need to. Men who knew him will stand the moment he walks in a room whether he wears a uniform or not. That's the kind of rank you don't earn from the Navy. That's the kind you earn from hell." As if on cue, a distant voice from the back of the hall added, "That man saved my platoon in Kandahar." Another said, "My instructor told me he once took point after being wounded just so a rookie wouldn't die on his first deployment." And another whispered, "He never talked about any of it, never took credit, just disappeared." Kyle felt his stomach twist with guilt so sharp it bordered on panic. He had mocked this man. He had joked about rank to someone whose very existence had reshaped the ranks of warriors across continents. And the worst part, the part that made Kyle's throat tighten, was that Commander Hale hadn't even gotten angry. He had simply looked at Kyle the way a man looks at a storm he has already survived. Across the room, Commander Hale finally finished his meal. He set down his fork, folded his napkin neatly, and pushed the tray aside. Then he lifted his gaze again, this time not at the SEALs but at Kyle directly. Kyle froze, every instinct screaming at him to look away, but he couldn't. Hale didn't glare or scowl. He simply regarded Kyle with a kind of tired understanding, like he had seen 1,000 versions of this moment and knew exactly how it tended to end. With a single breath, Hale said the words that would stay with Kyle for the rest of his life. "You measure men by what they show on their sleeves," he said quietly. "But the ones who make it home, we measure ourselves by what we had to carry inside." Kyle felt the room tilt around him. Some lessons were yelled. Others were beaten into you. But this one landed like truth forged in fire. And Kyle Mercer knew his life in the teams would never be the same. Commander Hale didn't move from his seat. Yet something in the mess hall had undeniably shifted around him. It was the kind of shift that happens when truth, long buried, surfaces in a place unprepared for it. Men who had walked into lunch thinking about protein macros and training schedules were now standing as if in the presence of a memorial. Conversations that would normally burst back to life remained suspended in the charged quiet that followed his words. No one knew what to do next, least of all Kyle Mercer, who felt every inch of his confidence collapsing inward. Kyle's teammates had pulled back slightly, not out of shame by association but to give him room, the way men do before a hard lesson unfolds. Nearby, Chief Henderson kept his jaw set, as though preparing Kyle for the moment he knew was coming. The older SEALs still stood at quiet attention, their respect not demanded but offered instinctively, the way soldiers stand at a funeral even when no order is given. Commander Hale reached for his coffee, lifted the mug with a steady, practiced motion, and took a sip. His hands didn't shake. They didn't falter. They held the cup like it weighed nothing, though in truth those hands had carried more suffering, more fear, more darkness than anyone else in that room ever would. As he set the mug down, the sleeve of his jacket shifted, and for a brief moment, Kyle caught a glimpse of something on the veteran's forearm. A pale, jagged scar that twisted down from the wrist and disappeared beneath the fabric. It didn't look like a wound earned from machinery or accidents. It had the shape of something deliberate, something violent. Kyle opened his mouth before he could stop himself. "Sir, what happened to your arm?" Several SEALs flinched. "You didn't ask Commander Hale about his scars. Not if you knew who he was." But Kyle didn't know. Not yet. Hale's eyes lowered to the scar as if he hadn't realized it was visible. He pulled the sleeve down again slowly, not in shame but in reflection. A quiet ripple rolled through the room as he looked back up at Kyle. "That one," Hale said calmly. "I got it in Marja. My whole team was pinned inside a collapsed compound. We were out of air, out of ammo, and out of time. There was only one way out, but the wall was wired with a pressure charge." Kyle felt himself leaning forward, drawn in despite the fear twisting his gut. Hale continued. "Someone had to crawl through the debris, find the exact point where the wire split, and cut it manually. There wasn't room for gear, barely room to breathe. But we didn't have a choice." Kyle swallowed. "You went in." Hale nodded once. "The youngest of my men was 21. Smart, brave, his whole life ahead of him. I wasn't going to send him into a space designed to kill whoever entered." Henderson whispered. "Christ, I heard about that mission." Hale's voice softened as if the memory was something fragile he didn't want to hold too tightly. "The wire snapped when I cut it. It didn't detonate, but it gave me that." He tapped his arm lightly, almost dismissively. "Small price to pay for 6 men walking out alive." Kyle's throat tightened. That scar wasn't a trophy. It was a ledger entry, a reminder of a decision no young SEAL had ever been forced to make yet. But Hale wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal dog tag, worn thin at the edges from years of rubbing against other tags. He turned it between his fingers before laying it on the table for Kyle to see. Kyle stepped closer and felt his chest clench when he read the name. It wasn't Hale's. It belonged to another man. "My commanding officer," Hale said quietly. "He didn't make it home. This is the only part of him I could carry. Men don't follow rank into battle, Mercer. They follow the ones willing to bleed first." Some SEALs lowered their eyes. Some clenched their fists. Some simply breathed deeper, as if reminded of why they joined in the first place. Kyle felt a weight settle on him. Not shame alone, but responsibility. He had mocked a man who had given parts of his life that Kyle hadn't even lived yet. And the worst part was that Hale wasn't angry. He wasn't lecturing. He wasn't seeking forgiveness or demanding respect. He was just telling the truth the same way he lived it, quietly, directly, and with no expectation of being understood. Hale finally leaned back, his gaze soft but unblinking. "War doesn't care about rank," he said. "It cares about choices. Choices made when no one is watching, and when everyone is counting on you." Kyle absorbed every word. Something inside him shifted. He had walked into lunch a loud young SEAL with something to prove. He was standing there now as a man suddenly aware of how far he still had to go. And Commander Hale wasn't finished teaching him yet. Kyle Mercer had been through Hell Week, drown-proofing, land warfare, cold water drills, countless evolutions designed to destroy the weak and temper the strong. Yet nothing had humbled him faster than standing before the quiet old man everyone else called a legend. The room still hummed with a suspended silence, the kind that forms when men realize they're sharing space with someone carved from the kind of truth training manuals can't capture. Kyle didn't know where to look. His eyes kept falling toward the dog tag Hale had placed on the table, its edges worn to a soft shine. It felt like a relic, sacred in a way Kyle wasn't sure he deserved to witness. Commander Hale picked it up again and closed his hand around it. Not protectively, but respectfully, like a man holding a memory rather than a piece of metal. Kyle forced himself to speak, though his voice cracked under the weight of everything he didn't know how to express. "Sir, I didn't mean, I shouldn't have." Hale raised a hand, stopping him with a simple gesture. There was no irritation in it, no reprimand, just a weary understanding, the kind that only comes from watching young men make the same mistakes through generation after generation. "You're not the first to talk before thinking," Hale said softly, "and you won't be the last. The uniform doesn't teach humility. Life does." Kyle absorbed that, but Hale's expression drifted slightly, as if he were seeing not the cafeteria but a distant memory, the kind built from dust, fear, and the sound of rotors in the dark. Kyle noticed the change and hesitated before asking, "Sir, how long did you serve?" Hale let out a slow breath. "Long enough that I stopped counting. Long enough to watch good men rise and fall. Long enough to know that the teams change, but the cost stays the same." Across the hall, a few senior SEALs nodded with grim familiarity. They knew exactly what he meant. Young operators only understood the adrenaline, the pride, the stories. Veterans understood the ledger, the quiet one that never stopped filling. Hale continued, "When you first earn the trident, you think it makes you 10 feet tall. You believe the world finally sees you as you see yourself. But that's the trap. The moment you start believing the trident makes you more than other men, you stop being worthy of it." Kyle swallowed hard. He had never felt so exposed. "I've seen men with racks full of ribbons crumble when things got real," Hale said. "And I've seen men with no rank at all walk through hell so others could live. Strength isn't loud. It isn't proud. It's quiet. It's steady. It shows up when no one is looking." Kyle found himself hanging onto every word, the arrogance in his chest collapsing like a poorly built structure. Hale turned slightly and gestured toward the room. "These men you see here, the ones who stand straight when I walk in, they don't do that for me. They do it for what I represent. Not rank, not glory, responsibility." Kyle felt something tighten behind his ribs, a realization forming with painful clarity. "Responsibility for what, sir?" Hale's voice dropped to something steady and low, the kind of tone men instinctively listen to. "For the lives around you, for the men beside you, for decisions that will haunt you long after the noise stops. Being a SEAL isn't about being better. It's about carrying more than others ever will." Silence followed again, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like a classroom where the walls had disappeared, replaced by a battlefield no instructor had the power to replicate. Hale studied Kyle for a moment, then added, "You've got potential, Mercer. Real potential. But potential doesn't mean anything until hardship tests it. You want to be the man your teammates trust? Then start by respecting the men who walked the path before you." Kyle's chest tightened. Something like shame, something like awakening, something like gratitude fighting its way up all at once. Hale leaned back in his chair, not looking triumphant or vindicated, just tired. Tired in a way only men who gave more than they kept ever looked. Kyle stepped forward with a shaky breath. "Sir, what would you have me do?" The old commander looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through every insecurity, every fear, every unspoken desire to be worthy. "Start by learning to listen," he said, "and not to the noise, to the things men say when they don't raise their voices." Kyle nodded slowly, committing the words to memory with the seriousness of a vow. In the far corner, a SEAL whispered to another, "Kids learning the hard way," but the whisper didn't sting, because for the first time since joining the teams, Kyle wasn't embarrassed by the lesson. He was grateful for it, and Commander Hale, whether he intended to or not, had just begun shaping him into someone different, someone better. The mess hall slowly shifted back into motion, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Where there had been laughter, there was now quiet respect. Where there had been careless bravado, there was thoughtful stillness. Men resumed eating, though each movement felt more deliberate than before. It was as if everyone sensed that they were witnessing something that wouldn't repeat itself. Something that would eventually become a whispered story passed between operators years from now. Commander Hale didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture or perform. He simply sat with the stillness of a mountain and the patience of a man who had waited decades for someone to ask the right questions. Kyle Mercer, once overflowing with youthful arrogance, now felt like a student standing before a teacher he never knew he needed. A young SEAL from another table approached hesitantly, tray in hand. He looked barely out of BUD/S, short hair still too neat, eyes still too bright. "Sir," he said quietly, "is it true you were at Sanjin?" During the corridor push, Hale didn't look irritated at being interrupted. If anything, his gaze softened slightly. "Yes," he answered. "I was there." The young SEAL nodded, then swallowed. "My instructor said no one who went through that operation ever came back the same." Hale's eyes drifted away for a moment, as if he were staring through time and sandbags and smoke. "Your instructor was right," he said simply. The young SEAL nodded again, whispered "Thank you, sir," and retreated. But the exchange didn't go unnoticed. It tugged at the room like a tide changing direction. More SEALs began to approach. Cautious, respectful, not wanting to intrude but also unwilling to waste the chance to stand near the man who had once been nothing more than a rumor. Kyle watched all of it in silence. Hale didn't brag. He didn't embellish. When asked about missions, he spoke briefly, factually, always shifting focus back to the men around him rather than himself. If someone mentioned a medal, Hale redirected the credit. If someone praised a decision he'd made, he pointed out the efforts of the team that had made the outcome possible. Kyle realized something he had never been taught in any training block. This was what real leadership looked like. Not loud, not boastful, not hungry for recognition. It was steady, selfless, focused entirely on others. Hale eventually turned back to Kyle, as if sensing there was still more to say between them. "Do you know what the hardest part of command is?" he asked. Kyle shook his head. "It's not giving orders. It's living with the memories of the orders you gave." Kyle's breath caught. That wasn't the answer he expected. He thought leadership was about authority, control, decisiveness. Hale's answer held none of those things. It held weight and pain. Hale continued, "There were nights I prayed for clarity. Not courage, not strength, clarity. Because every choice you make affects the men who trust you. And some decisions follow you for the rest of your life." Kyle nodded slowly, feeling the meaning of those words sink into him like steel. Across the room, Henderson stepped closer. "Sir," he said quietly, "I remember reading something in the after-action report from Helmand. They said you walked 2 miles back into enemy territory alone. Is that true?" Hale sighed softly, not with annoyance, but with the fatigue of a man who no longer wanted to be the center of a legend. "A young corpsman was missing," he said. "I wasn't leaving without him." Kyle stared. Did you find him?" Hale gave a small nod. "I did. He was hurt, but alive." "And the people who took him?" Another SEAL asked from behind. Hale didn't brag. He didn't posture. He just said, "They won't be taking anyone else." The room exhaled like one large organism. No one cheered. No one needed to. Kyle finally stepped forward. "Sir," he said carefully, "why did you walk away? Why retire completely? Men like you, men who've done what you've done, they usually end up running the teams." Hale looked down at the dog tag in his hand again and closed his fist. "Because leadership doesn't mean staying in front forever. Sometimes it means stepping aside so the next generation can rise without your shadow covering them." Kyle had no answer. No training had prepared him for this lesson. No drill instructor had ever explained the kind of courage required to walk away, to choose humility over legacy. And in that moment, the old commander spoke the line that struck Kyle's heart so cleanly, it felt like truth itself peeling away everything he thought he understood. Young men rush to be seen, Hale said. Old men learn the value of being unseen. Silence washed through the room. It wasn't the silence of shock this time. It was the silence of understanding. Kyle knew now that meeting this man wasn't a coincidence. It was the kind of moment that shaped operators long before they ever stepped onto foreign soil. Commander Hale wasn't merely correcting him. He was preparing him. And Kyle, for the first time in his life, wanted to live up to something bigger than himself. The mess hall had shifted from a lunchroom to something closer to a sanctuary. Men came and went quietly now, stepping around Commander Hale's table with the same reverence they might show a folded flag. Young SEALs who hadn't even spoken to him found themselves glancing his way, as if trying to memorize every detail of the moment they knew would become legend long after they graduated to their first deployment. Kyle Mercer remained rooted where he stood, not because he felt obligated, but because he felt changed. The arrogance that had walked in with him had dissolved completely, replaced by a feeling he couldn't quite name. Maybe. Humility, definitely. But there was something more. A pull, a need to understand the man behind the silence. Commander Hale finished the last sip of his lukewarm coffee and set the mug aside. He seemed ready to stand, to quietly slip away the same way he had entered. But Kyle, driven by a mixture of fear and earnestness, stepped forward before Hale could rise. Sir. One more question? Kyle asked, voice tight. A few SEALs who had been approaching paused, sensing something important was about to happen. Hale looked at Kyle with that steady, patient gaze that had already dismantled the young man's entire worldview. Go ahead. Kyle hesitated, searching for the right words. He'd asked about missions. He'd asked about scars. He'd asked about leadership. But the question forming now was different. It wasn't about war or tactics or reputation. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere he didn't even know existed before today. Sir, how did you live with it? Kyle asked softly. The choices, the missions, the losses. How did you carry all of it? It was the question no one ever asked. The question SEALs learned to bury behind jokes, bravado, protein shakes, and battle drills. The question instructors never dared answer honestly because some truths were too heavy to hand to men who hadn't walked far enough yet. Every conversation in the room stilled again. Commander Hale didn't speak immediately. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and let out a slow exhale, as if he'd been asked something he had spent half a lifetime thinking about but rarely put into words. When I was your age, Hale began, I thought strength meant refusing to feel anything. I thought toughness meant closing every door inside myself and locking them so nothing could get in. He paused. But that's not strength. That's hiding. Kyle felt something twist inside his chest. Hale continued, his voice low, steady, almost painfully honest. The truth is, you don't carry the weight. The weight carries you. Every man you lose. Every decision you wish you could take back. Every moment when fear told you to stop but you kept going anyway. You don't shake those things off. You learn to walk with them. A SEAL who had been leaning against the wall straightened, swallowing hard. Hale went on. Some nights are quiet. Some aren't. But you don't run from it, Mercer. You don't pretend it didn't happen. You face it. You let it teach you. And you make damn sure you become the kind of man whose choices honor the ones who didn't come home. Kyle's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with the sting he refused to let fall. Hale's voice softened even more. You asked me how I lived with it. The truth is, you don't live with it alone. You live with it for them. Every day you wake up and put on the uniform, every time you step onto a range or take a dive or run a drill, you're carrying their unfinished stories. That's the price. And that's the privilege. Kyle lowered his head, overwhelmed. For the first time since earning his trident, he understood the true cost of the symbol he wore. Commander Hale slowly stood. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself with the gravity of a man who had walked through fire and come out forged rather than broken. He placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, not as correction, not as reprimand, but as something that felt impossibly close to acceptance. You'll make mistakes, Hale said. But if you learn from them, truly learn, you might one day be a man worth following. Kyle swallowed hard. Sir, I want to be. Hale nodded. Then start today. The simplicity of the statement crushed Kyle more than any insult ever could. It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't a judgment. It was a challenge. A challenge only the brave ever understood. Commander Hale stepped back and reached for his jacket. He slipped it on slowly, methodically, the way a man would settle into an identity he'd tried for years to put behind him. As he adjusted the collar, the faint outline of old unit stitching, long removed but still faintly visible, caught the light. Several SEALs noticed. None dared comment. And then, without ceremony, without announcement, Commander Hale began walking toward the exit. Every man in that room straightened instinctively, not because of rank, not because of regulation, but because something inside each of them knew. They were in the presence of a man who had earned respect the hard way, quietly, painfully, and without ever asking for it. Kyle took a breath. He wasn't ready for him to leave. Something was still unfinished. And Hale, as if sensing that truth, paused at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the metal frame. What he said next would change everything. Commander Hale stood at the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the cool metal frame, his back half turned to the room full of men who had fallen completely silent at his departure. He didn't look grand or imposing. He didn't radiate the drama of a war hero walking into the sunset. He simply stood there, still and thoughtful, as if weighing whether to speak or let the moment pass. Kyle Mercer felt the weight of the moment in his chest. He knew, instinctively, that whatever Hale chose to say next wasn't going to be about glory or medals or missions. It would be something real, something costly, something a young SEAL might carry for the rest of his life. Hale finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that the room leaned in without realizing it. "You want to know the truth, Mercer?" he said, still not turning fully around. "The world doesn't remember the loud men. Not for long. It remembers the ones who kept their promises." Kyle's breath caught. He didn't know why those words dug so deep, but they did, clean, sharp, honest. Hale continued, his hands still on the frame. "Every mission I ever took, every man I ever led, every scar I carry now, comes down to one simple question." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "Did I do right by the men who trusted me?" A few SEALs looked down at their boots. Others exhaled slowly, hearing something they'd never been told directly before. Kyle felt his throat tighten. That was the lesson. The real one. The one no BUD/S instructor ever said out loud. Hale turned slightly, just enough for the room to see his profile. The lines on his face carved by years of dust, loss, and hard choices softened in a way none of them expected. "You're all strong," he said. "Strong enough to fight. Strong enough to win. But strength isn't what saves men out there." Kyle whispered, "What does?" Hale looked directly at him now. "Honor," he said simply. "The kind you defend long after the shooting stops." The mess hall held its breath. Hale slipped his hands into his jacket pockets, an ordinary gesture that somehow made him seem more human and more extraordinary at the same time. "I won't be around forever," he said quietly. "Men like me, we fade. But you," he nodded to Kyle, then to the other young SEALs. "You're the ones who decide what the teams become next." Kyle felt something swell in his chest. Fear, hope, responsibility all tangled together. Hale added, "Just promise me you'll carry the weight the right way, with humility, with courage, and with respect for the men who walked the path before you." Then, in a gesture that shocked even the senior operators, he raised a hand. Not in salute, but in something almost gentler. Farewell. A blessing. A passing of the torch. "Do that," Hale said, "and you'll never need rank to lead." He turned toward the exit again, but before stepping through it, he offered one final truth. A truth so quiet and so piercing it froze every man in his place. "The strongest warrior," he said, "is the one who doesn't need to be seen to make a difference." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like an echo of something sacred. Kyle stood motionless, heart pounding, eyes tracking the doorway long after Hale disappeared from sight. He knew with absolute certainty that this day would follow him for the rest of his life. It wasn't a lesson. It wasn't a lecture. It was an inheritance, one he hadn't earned yet, but one he was determined to honor. Across the room, Chief Henderson finally broke the silence. He clapped Kyle on the shoulder once, firm but not unkind. "Well, Mercer," he murmured. "Looks like you picked one hell of a man to learn from." Kyle nodded, jaw set with new conviction. "I won't waste it." And for the first time since earning his trident, Kyle felt like he understood what it meant to wear it. Not for recognition, not for pride, but for the weight he now carried willingly. The mess hall gradually returned to motion, but every man who walked out that day walked a little straighter, a little quieter, a little more aware of the legacy living among them. Commander Hale didn't need medals. He didn't need rank. He had left something far more powerful behind. A room full of warriors forever changed by a man who taught them that the greatest strength is found not in the noise of battle, but in the quiet of character. In the end, Commander Thomas Hale didn't leave the mess hall as a legend. He left the way he had lived, quietly, humbly, without expecting recognition from the men whose lives had been shaped by sacrifices they would never fully understand. And maybe that is what made him extraordinary. Heroes who shout their victories are remembered for a moment. But the ones who carry their scars in silence, who lead without demanding praise, who teach through the weight of experience rather than the noise of ego, those are the men who shape generations long after their boots stop touching the battlefield. Kyle Mercer would go on to deploy, to lead, to fail, to rise again. But every choice he made from that day forward carried a piece of the lesson Hale gave him, unspoken, priceless, and earned the hard way. And that is the true measure of a warrior's legacy. Not medals, not stories, not rank, but the way their character continues to guide others long after they're gone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet giants who walk among us, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who needs a moment of strength, and subscribe to Endless Stories for more powerful tales of courage, humility, and the people whose impact never fades. Some heroes don't ask to be seen, but once you meet them, you never forget them.